The verdict came back in 14 minutes, guilty on all counts. The defendant, who had been confident just hours earlier, sat stunned as his attorney frantically shuffled papers, looking for grounds for appeal. What had changed? 7 words from a witness the defense had spent 3 days trying to destroy. "I was a Marine Corps sniper, sir." The woman they dismissed as a disabled, unreliable observer had credentials that made their entire strategy look like amateur hour. Before we begin, I want to ask you something. Have you ever been dismissed because of how you look? Have you ever had people doubt your abilities based on their assumptions? If so, share your story in the comments below. I read every single one. And who knows, maybe the next story we tell here on Veterans Past Stories will be about you. 3 months earlier, Riverside Park had been Sarah Mitchell's sanctuary. Every Tuesday evening at 6 p.m., she wheeled herself along the paved paths, fed the ducks by the pond, and sat on the accessible platform overlooking the water. At 38 years old, with 7 years since her medical discharge from the Marine Corps, Sarah had built a quiet life around these simple routines. The park was beautiful in early September. Golden light filtered through the oak trees, families played on the lawns, joggers passed by with friendly nods. Sarah had chosen this spot specifically because the wheelchair-accessible platform gave her a clear view of the entire park. Old habits from her sniper days, always choosing elevated positions with good sightlines. On this particular Tuesday, she arrived at her usual spot at 5:47 p.m. 13 minutes early. She noticed things others wouldn't. The couple arguing near the fountain, their body language escalating. The teenager who'd been circling the parking lot 3 times in a silver Honda Civic. The man in the expensive suit checking his watch repeatedly near the east entrance. Sarah had learned long ago that observation was both her greatest skill and her greatest curse. In the Marines, it had made her one of the most effective snipers in her unit. In civilian life, it meant she noticed details she couldn't unsee, patterns she couldn't ignore. At 6:14 p.m., the man in the expensive suit met another man near the public restrooms. The second man was younger, maybe 30, wearing a leather jacket despite the warm weather. Sarah didn't mean to watch them. She was reading her book, but movement caught her trained eye. The conversation looked tense. The younger man's hands moved in aggressive gestures. The suited man stepped back, reaching into his jacket for his wallet. Sarah assumed. Then everything happened in the span of 7 seconds. The younger man pulled out a gun. The suited man raised his hands. A single shot. The suited man fell. The younger man looked around quickly, spotted no immediate witnesses, and walked calmly toward the parking lot where the silver Honda was waiting. Sarah's book fell from her lap. Her military training kicked in immediately. Assessment mode. Distance from her position to the shooting, approximately 50 feet. Lighting, excellent. Golden hour sun. Visibility, clear, no obstructions. Shooter's description, white male, approximately 5'10", brown leather jacket, dark jeans, tribal tattoo, visible on left neck. Vehicle, silver Honda Civic, partial plate visible, 7K something 42. Sarah pulled out her phone with shaking hands. Not from fear, from the adrenaline response her body still had to violence, even years after leaving the service. She dialed 911. 911? What's your emergency? There's been a shooting at Riverside Park, east side near the public restrooms. 1 victim down, gunshot wound to the chest. Shooter fled in a silver Honda Civic, partial plate 7K something 42, heading north on Riverside Drive. Ma'am, are you safe? Is the shooter still present? Negative. Shooter departed approximately 45 seconds ago. Victim appears unresponsive. I'm in a wheelchair. I can't reach him to check vitals. Officers are en route. Please stay on the line. Sarah stayed on the line, watching as other park visitors began to notice the man lying motionless near the restrooms. Screams erupted.
People ran.
The peaceful park transformed into chaos. Police arrived within 3 minutes. Paramedics within 5.
Is she Sarah?
Sarah gave her statement to the first responding officer, a young man who seemed overwhelmed by the scene. You saw the actual shooting? He asked, his pen hovering over his notepad. Affirmative. I had a direct line of sight from my position on the accessible platform. And you're sure about what you saw? Something in his tone made Sarah look up sharply. Yes, officer, I'm sure. It's just, you're pretty far away, and he gestured vaguely toward her wheelchair. I'm in a wheelchair, Sarah said flatly. My legs don't work. My eyes work fine. The officer flushed. I didn't mean, I saw a murder, officer. The shooter was a white male, approximately 5'10", brown leather jacket, tribal tattoo on his left neck. He fled in a silver Honda Civic with a partial plate, 7K something 42. You'll want to check traffic cameras on Riverside Drive northbound. The officer wrote everything down, but Sarah could see the skepticism in his eyes. She'd seen that look before, people doubting her capabilities because they saw the wheelchair first and the person second. Detective James Morrison arrived 20 minutes later. He was in his 50s with gray hair and the tired eyes of someone who'd seen too much violence. He approached Sarah's wheelchair with more respect than the first officer, but she could still sense the questions behind his professional demeanor. "Mrs. Mitchell, I understand you witnessed the shooting." "Miss Mitchell," Sarah corrected. "And yes, I did. Can you walk me through exactly what you saw?" Sarah repeated her account, adding details she'd remembered. The argument looked like it was about money. The victim had tried to pull something from his jacket before being shot. The shooter had checked for witnesses before fleeing. "That's very detailed," Detective Morrison said. "You have good observational skills. I was trained for it." "Trained?" He looked interested now. "Marine Corps. Retired." Something shifted in his expression, not dismissal, but calculation. "What was your MOS?" 0317. "Scout Sniper." Detective Morrison's pen stopped moving. He looked at Sarah with new eyes, seeing past the wheelchair to the soldier she had been. "How many years?" "2 tours, Iraq and Afghanistan. Medical discharge 7 years ago." "And you're certain about what you saw today?" "Detective, I was trained to identify targets at 800 yards through a scope. I can tell you the shooter had a scar above his right eyebrow and was wearing a silver watch on his left wrist. From 50 feet away in good lighting? That's like asking if I'm certain I saw something in my living room." Detective Morrison nodded slowly. "We're going to need a formal statement, and Miss Mitchell, thank you for your service." It was the first time that evening anyone had acknowledged that her military background might actually make her a more reliable witness, not less. The victim was pronounced dead at the scene. His name was Robert Chen, 45, a financial advisor with a wife and 2 children. The investigation began immediately, and Sarah's description led police to identify a suspect within 48 hours, Marcus Webb, 31, with a criminal history including assault and illegal firearms possession. Sarah thought that would be the end of her involvement. She'd given her statement, provided her observations, done her civic duty. But 2 weeks later, she received a subpoena. The trial of Marcus Webb was scheduled for 3 months later. The prosecution called Sarah as their key eyewitness, the only person who had seen the actual shooting. Everything else was circumstantial. Webb's car on traffic cameras, gunshot residue on clothing found in his apartment, financial records showing Robert Chen had loaned Webb $50,000 that was never repaid. But Sarah had seen the murder. Sarah could identify the shooter. The problem, as the prosecution team explained to her during trial preparation, was that the defense attorney was known for destroying witnesses on cross-examination, especially witnesses who might seem vulnerable to a jury. "He's going to attack your credibility," Assistant District Attorney Jennifer Park warned Sarah during their meeting. "He'll focus on the distance, the lighting, your physical limitations." "My wheelchair," Sarah said bluntly. "Yes," Jennifer admitted. "He'll suggest that being in a wheelchair might impair your ability to observe accurately. It's offensive, and it's not true, but he'll try it." "Let him try," Sarah said calmly. She had faced worse than hostile attorneys. She had faced enemy combatants who wanted her dead. A lawyer trying to make her look unreliable was, by comparison, just noise. The trial began on a cold Monday in December. The courtroom was packed. Robert Chen's widow and children sat in the front row, their grief palpable. Marcus Webb sat at the defense table, dressed in a suit that made him look more like a businessman than a killer. His attorney, Richard Blackwood, was exactly as advertised. Expensive suit, perfect hair, a smile that never reached his eyes. He had built his career on reasonable doubt, on finding the tiny cracks in prosecution cases and turning them into chasms. Sarah sat in the witness waiting room for 2 days, while other witnesses testified. The medical examiner, the responding officers, the forensics experts, each one building the case piece by piece. On Wednesday afternoon, Jennifer Park came to get her.
"You're up."
"Remember, stay calm. Answer only what's asked. Don't let him rattle you." "I won't," Sarah promised. The bailiff called her name. The prosecution calls Sarah Mitchell. Sarah wheeled herself into the courtroom. The jury's eyes followed her progress, 12 faces trying not to stare at the wheelchair but unable to look away. She took her position in the witness box, which had been modified with a ramp for accessibility. After being sworn in, Jennifer Park began her direct examination. The questions were straightforward: what Sarah had seen, when, from where, how certain she was of the details. Sarah answered each question clearly, precisely, without embellishment. She described the shooting exactly as it had happened, maintaining eye contact with the jury, speaking with the calm authority of someone who had testified in military debriefings. "And you're absolutely certain the defendant is the man you saw shoot Robert Chen?" Jennifer asked. Sarah looked directly at Marcus Webb. "Yes, that's the man who pulled the trigger." "No further questions, Your Honor," Jennifer said. Then Richard Blackwood stood for cross-examination, and the real battle began. "Miss Mitchell," he said, his voice dripping with false sympathy, "I want to first thank you for your service to our country." "Thank you," Sarah replied neutrally. "You mentioned you were in the Marines. Infantry?" "No, sir." "What was your role?" "Scout sniper." A murmur went through the courtroom, but Blackwood's expression didn't change. He had clearly done his research. "I see. And you left the service 7 years ago due to a medical discharge. Can you tell the jury about that?" "Objection." Jennifer stood. "Relevance." "Your Honor, the witness's physical condition is directly relevant to her ability to observe and testify accurately." The judge considered. "I'll allow it, but keep it brief." Counselor. Blackwood turned back to Sarah. "Miss Mitchell, why were you medically discharged?" "I was injured in combat. I lost the use of my legs." "So you're paralyzed from the waist down?" "Yes." "And you're confined to a wheelchair?" Sarah felt the familiar flash of irritation at the word confined, but kept her voice level. "I use a wheelchair for mobility, yes." "That must be very difficult," Blackwood said with manufactured concern. "I manage." "I'm sure you do." He paced in front of the jury box. "Now, on the evening of the shooting, you were sitting in your wheelchair on the accessible platform, correct?" "Correct." "And the shooting occurred near the public restrooms, which, according to the crime scene photos, is approximately 50 feet from that platform." "That's accurate." "50 feet is quite a distance, Miss Mitchell." "Not particularly. For someone in a wheelchair, sitting lower than standing height, looking across a park with trees and other obstructions." "There were no obstructions," Sarah interrupted. "The platform is elevated specifically to provide clear sight lines. That's why I chose that location." "That's why I chose that location." Blackwood smiled, not friendly, but predatory. "You chose that location. Do you often position yourself with clear sight lines?" "I prefer open spaces. It's comfortable for me." "Because of your military training?" "Perhaps." "So you're hyper-vigilant. You're constantly scanning for threats." "I'm observant." Some might say hyper-vigilant observation from a distance, especially from someone with acknowledged physical limitations. "My physical limitations are in my legs, Counselor," Sarah said, her voice sharpening slightly. "Not my eyes. But you're lower to the ground than a standing person would be. Your perspective is different. My perspective is from approximately 3.5 feet instead of 6 feet. That doesn't impair my vision." Blackwood changed tactics. "Miss Mitchell, you mentioned you were reading a book when the shooting occurred, so you weren't actively watching the area where the shooting happened." "I noticed movement in my peripheral vision." "Peripheral vision. From 50 feet away. While reading." "Yes." "And in the 7 seconds the shooting occurred," you said 7 seconds, correct?" "Correct." "In 7 seconds you managed to observe the shooter's height, clothing, tattoo location, and vehicle, all from 50 feet away from a lower vantage point while being startled by gunfire." "Yes." Blackwood's voice rose with practiced disbelief. "Miss Mitchell, with all due respect, you're asking this jury to believe that a disabled woman sitting in a wheelchair 50 feet away, distracted by a book, somehow managed to observe and remember all these details in just 7 seconds." The courtroom was silent. The jury looked skeptical. Even Jennifer Park looked concerned. Sarah took a slow breath. She had been waiting for this moment, the moment when her credibility would be questioned not based on facts, but on assumptions about her disability. "Counselor," she said calmly, "may I respond?" "Please do," Blackwood said, confidence radiating from every pore. "You've spent the last 20 minutes suggesting that being in a wheelchair somehow impairs my ability to observe accurately. You've implied that my perspective, my physical condition, and my position all combine to make me an unreliable witness. That's my concern." "Yes," Blackwood said. Sarah looked directly at the jury. "I was a Marine Corps scout sniper."
Do you know what that means?
Before Blackwood could object, she continued, "It means I was trained to identify and engage targets at distances up to 800 yards. That's 2,400 feet. I was trained to read terrain, wind conditions, and human behavior from distances that would make 50 feet look like standing in the same room." The jury was leaning forward now, listening intently. "I was trained to identify targets by silhouette, by gait, by the smallest details of clothing and equipment. I was trained to observe and remember under the stress of combat, not just the stress of hearing a gunshot in a park. Blackwood tried to interrupt, but Sarah wasn't finished. The defense wants you to believe that being in a wheelchair makes me less capable of observation. But I can tell you right now, from where I'm sitting, that juror number 3 is wearing a wedding ring with a small scratch on the band, that the clock on the back wall shows 3:47 p.m., and that the court reporter's keyboard has a sticking E key that she compensates for. The jury turned to look. Juror number 3 instinctively checked his ring. The scratch was there. The clock did show 3:47. The court reporter looked stunned. 50 feet, in good lighting to observe a murder? Sarah said. That's not a challenge, counselor. That's Tuesday afternoon. The courtroom erupted in whispers. Blackwood's confident expression had cracked. Jennifer Park was trying not to smile. I was a Marine Corps sniper, sir, Sarah said, her voice carrying the authority of her former rank. What I was trained to do is see, distance doesn't matter. Wheelchair doesn't matter. What matters is training, discipline, and attention to detail. And I'm telling this jury, under oath, that Marcus Webb is the man I saw murder Robert Chen. Blackwood stood frozen for a moment, his entire cross-examination strategy in ruins. He glanced at his notes, then at the jury, then back at Sarah. No further questions, he said quietly. The damage was done. In trying to destroy her credibility, he had given her the perfect platform to establish it beyond any doubt. Jennifer Park's redirect was brief. Just a few questions to emphasize Sarah's qualifications and training. But it was barely necessary. The jury had already made up their minds. Closing arguments came the next day. The defense tried to recover, arguing that circumstantial evidence wasn't enough, that reasonable doubt existed, but every time Blackwood mentioned the eyewitness testimony, the jury remembered the woman who could spot a scratched wedding ring from across a courtroom. The jury deliberated for 14 minutes. Guilty on all counts. First-degree murder. Marcus Webb's face went white as the verdict was read. His attorney frantically requested polling of the jury, searching for any dissent. There was none. All 12 jurors were certain. After the verdict, Sarah wheeled herself out of the courtroom. Robert Chen's widow stopped her in the hallway. "Thank you," the woman said, tears streaming down her face. "Thank you for seeing what happened, for remembering, for being brave enough to testify." Sarah took the woman's hands. "I'm sorry for your loss. I wish I could have done more." "You did everything," the widow said. "You gave us justice." Detective Morrison approached as the widow walked away. "That was impressive testimony, Miss Mitchell. I just told the truth. You did more than that. You reminded everyone in that courtroom that assumptions about disability don't override facts, that training and skill matter more than physical appearance." Sarah smiled slightly. "Someone needed to. The ADA's office wants to know if you'd be willing to testify in future cases. You'd be an excellent expert witness on observation and identification." "I'll think about it," Sarah said. As she wheeled herself toward the elevator, Jennifer Park caught up with her. "Sarah, I wanted to apologize." "For what?" "For doubting you, for worrying that the jury might see you as a vulnerable witness instead of a credible one. You're one of the strongest witnesses I've ever seen." "People make assumptions," Sarah said. "About the wheelchair, about what I can and can't do. I'm used to it. You shouldn't have to be." "No," Sarah agreed. "But until the world changes, I'll keep proving those assumptions wrong." The story made headlines. Disabled Marine sniper's testimony, convict's killer. News outlets wanted interviews. Disability rights organizations wanted to celebrate her. The Marine Corps released a statement commending her service both in uniform and as a civilian. But Sarah declined most of the attention. She went back to her Tuesday routine, sitting in Riverside Park, feeding the ducks, reading her books, except now, she sat in a different spot. Not on the accessible platform with clear sightlines, but down by the water where the view was limited and peaceful. She had spent years in the Marines training to see everything, to miss nothing, to be always vigilant. It had served her well in combat and in that courtroom. But sometimes, Sarah thought, it was okay to sit somewhere you couldn't see the whole park. Sometimes it was okay to just watch the ducks and let the world exist beyond your sightlines. She had proven what she needed to prove. She had gotten justice for Robert Chen and his family. She had reminded the world that disability didn't mean inability. Now she could rest, but the book in her lap remained unread, and her eyes still tracked movement across the park. Old habits, it seemed, never completely died. "Before you go, I want to hear from you. Have you ever had to prove yourself to people who doubted your abilities? Have you ever been underestimated because of something beyond your control? Share your story in the comments. I read every single one. And if you believe that capability matters more than appearance, Hit that subscribe button for more powerful stories from veterans' past stories.